Hello and welcome to the Dyson Sphere program. I've been a little bit busy creating the Dyson Sphere, as you can see. So what I'll do in this video is I'll show you what it takes to actually build the Dyson Sphere. Now, for demonstration purposes, little bits and pieces are not complete yet. It's just a matter of time for these bits to be filled in, but if they are not filled in, then some of the things that it actually takes to fill the last little pieces in will actually be shown. Otherwise it would just be sort of static and you wouldn't be able to see anything. So what does it take to actually build the Dyson Sphere? So the first step is actually to put these, as you can see, these solar sails here in orbit, and that actually unlocks fairly early on. I think it's around the time of the red cubes, maybe a little bit after that. So what you need to do is to actually build them on your planet and then shoot them into orbit around the sun, which you can see is going on here from the planet that I'm on at the moment, and usually it will also be going on from one other planet in this. Oh yeah, you can see here it's also going on from this planet here, just to speed things up in my case. So I'll show you sort of how to do that in just a minute. So what you can see here is these, what are they called, EM rail ejectors, that are consuming the solar rails and shooting them into orbit. So if we look up, if you go past some of the huge things behind me, if you look up, it's kind of hard to see, but they are being shot at towards the sun. And what you have to do to make all of that happen is that you need to create these orbits for these solar cells. So I've configured 6, but I'm only actually using 3. So the way that you do that is you go into edit orbits, and then for the Dyson swarm you can select one particular orbit, and it gives you a little bit of information about it, and if you want to add another one you have a few sliders that you can play around with here on the radius, the inclination and the longitude. The recommendation I would give is that have some diversity in the orbits that you pick. So for example, you can see I have one orbit going this way, one orbit going that way, and then another orbit going this way. And that means that it minimizes some of the time that they have to travel as they join the Dyson Sphere, these solar sails. And I'll show you that mechanic in a minute as well. And it also means that you have a broader, so the EM rail ejectors can't always actually shoot out the solar sails. It depends on if they have a clear line of fire, I suppose. And if you have some diversity, then the amount of time that you can actually use that goes up. So that's why I'd recommend going for a few different configurations for your orbits and not just go for the default one. Okay, so then after you have the solar sails in orbit, what do you do after that to actually create this structure? So what you have to do for that is plan out the Dyson shell, and you can see I've only actually planned out one Dyson shell, and it's a little bit of a patchwork. It's done differently in different ways because of the things that I realized and kind of what the bottlenecks were and so on. So when you go into this layer here, what you need to do, and I've done this already all over the place, but you need to kind of pick an area where you put these I don't know what you call them, but these structural points. And then after you put them somewhere, you need to then connect them up to form shapes. And then what happens is that and I'll show you the building where it happens, you can see this piece of the frame is being transported into the Dyson Sphere, into one of the I don't know where it's going, I lost it, but it's going into one of the slots for the Dyson shell, I suppose, and then it gradually builds out. Firstly, this middle bit, and then the rings connecting the middle, I don't know, the nodes or whatever, and that's required to actually put sort of a supporting structure around the actual shell. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's fairly straightforward. So you put together the frame by clicking around in different places, and then once you have created a sort of some sort of sphere, some sort of enclosing shape, then you pick this I guess this sort of area, and you highlight one of these areas, and then you click, and then it informs the Dyson shell that it needs to be constructed there. So if I get out of this, you can see these these launch pads here, and that's where the you should be able to see a launch in just a minute. This is where the shell frames are actually launched up towards the Dyson Sphere, and it's a fairly lengthy construction from end to end, and you need to scale that up quite significantly, otherwise the construction for the Dyson shell takes a really long time, which is not yet the outcome. Now, these missile silos or launch silo are actually a little bit easier to place than the EM rail ejectors. As you can see, none of the EM rail ejectors are actually firing at the moment. That's because there's no line of sight, right? But the rockets are still, or the carrier rockets are still being launched because they don't require line of sight, which is quite handy. So once the shell has actually been constructed, which you can see here, what happens next is that, and I'll try and zoom in so you can actually see it, is that the solar sails will start to converge onto the piece of the shell, and you can see that sort of happening here from a few different directions, and as they merge in, this the Dyson Sphere is going to be filled in from the node outwards, and the rate that this happens at largely depends on the number of solar sails that you have in orbit. If your solar sails in orbit aren't visible, that means that you are constrained by the number of the solar sails that you actually have. But as you can see in this case, the rate of building the Dyson Sphere doesn't depend on it anymore, because there's an excess of the solar sails in orbit. And yeah, so they are just going to slowly over time build out the pieces of the shell around each particular node. Maybe I can find one that's currently, you can see here that's what it looks like as it's being constructed. So it just gradually fills in the gaps until the whole Dyson Sphere is sort of continuous. So that's constructing the Dyson Sphere. Now, one comment I would make is that there's actually not that much energy, like 12.1 gigawatts, if this W stands for watts, isn't actually that much energy. I would have expected a lot more from this kind of construction. So I don't think it's unusual to produce gigawatts in the current level of technology that we have today, and we certainly don't have the technology to actually build this. Now, one piece of advice I would give for constructing the Dyson Sphere is to don't go for the smallest size of these, I guess, these panels, because these nodes are actually far more material intensive to consume, and also time to produce. I mean, so it's a lot easier to produce a huge number of solar cells than it is to produce a huge number of these nodes, just because the production line is much longer and the material that it takes is far more. So you can see sort of when I started at the top, I actually created fairly small panels, and it took a really long time to actually build this out. But in the bottom one, I have these huge panels, and they still fill out completely. I haven't ever been able to build one of these panels that's so big that it doesn't get filled in. So for the sake of speed, reducing the number of nodes seemed to make it a lot faster, or reduce the time that it actually takes to construct the Dyson Sphere. To actually be able to use the Dyson Sphere, there are a few, well, there's one building that, and I've planted one of them over here, but I might have to change planets to show you kind of a little bit more. Actually, maybe I'll just do it from here. So there's this building called the Ray Receiver. Actually, I'll show this, but I'll also go to the other planet because I was going to make a point. So this, the Ray Receiver kind of connects to the Dyson Sphere and then outputs power into your local grid from it. So you can see that it's requesting about 13 megawatts and actually putting in 10 megawatts. That's because the grid on this planet is kind of oversupplied with power. But the key thing to take a look at here is the continuous receiving metric, and this actually, I think, doubles the maximum output that the Ray Receiver will produce, but for that it needs to have a continuous connection, which is kind of difficult to maintain on this planet because it actually circles around this other gas giant, and then any particular part of the planet isn't always in line of sight with the Dyson Sphere. So I actually didn't mass build these Ray receivers on this planet because there wasn't much of a point, because they would always, this thing has been planted for a really long time, but it's still not at 100% continuous receiving, and that's because it keeps losing connection, which is kind of a bit of a pain. But anyway, this building is how you get the power down from the Dyson Sphere, and there are kind of two things that you can do. You can either use it for power generation, which just outputs power into the local grid, or you can do this photon generation. And actually I guess the output power is a lot higher when you do photon generation. If you can see, if it's just on power, it's at about 10 megawatts, but if it's on photon generation, it's on 50 megawatts. So you might ask, well, what's the point of photon generation? Well, you can actually produce, turn these critical photons, I think, into antimatter, and then there's a way of creating another form of power, or another fuel. So there's this antimatter fuel rod, which is quite useful. But you can also create, actually it's not here, but you can combine it with these annihilation constraint spheres, and then there is there's a way, it's right over here, there's a way of producing, I can't remember what it's called, but like an antimatter type fuel that you can put into this power generator. It's actually the most powerful or the largest power output building that you can construct in Dyson Sphere. I think this can produce about 75 megawatts, but the problem with it is that it actually means that your power I guess chain has consumables, which is not the best way of producing power, because it's just gonna run out eventually, and it's also going to increase your raw material consumption. So I didn't actually find this was a really good way of generating power, although it's, you know, it's pretty cool. I should have actually created something I could put in here to show you what it looks like, but it's basically like a mini sun appears in here and it generates a whole bunch of power, which is pretty cool. So what I'm gonna do now is take you, if I can find it, take you to another planet. I think it's, the problem I have is that it's actually fairly close to the Dyson Sphere and I can't quite see where it is at the moment. But that's okay. We will maybe make a circle. Oh, there it is. Biscuum 1? I don't know if that's the right way of calling it. But we'll fly through the Dyson Sphere so you can see it a little bit as well. So let's kind of dive down here. That looks pretty cool, right? Okay, I think I've missed, here we go. So just need to change and break. And here we go. Okay. So on this planet, because it's so close to the Dyson Sphere, the ray receivers can actually maintain a connection with the Dyson Sphere much more consistently. So that's why I constructed most of the power consumption on this planet rather than my other planet. And I'll show you how the power actually ends up being on that home planet as well. So as you can see here, the continuous receiving is at 100%, and that actually means that it can produce a lot more power than it did on the other planet. And then on here, the photon generation is also a lot more effective. Oh, and by the way, this is the photon. Critical photon is not only used for energy; it's also used for creating one of the inputs for the last piece of research. So the white cube. I can show you the recipe for that actually. Here, so it's the antimatter on the very right that is generated through the critical photon. If I can see it here, I don't think it actually shows up on this screen because you can't actually produce it in the replicator. But actually, what if we click on this? Let me click on that. Yeah, so you can see this critical photon in a particle collider gets converted into antimatter, and then you can produce this antimatter fuel rod, which you then put into that what do you call it? I think it's in the Dyson Sphere program. Yeah, into this artificial star. Yeah, as you can see there, that's what it looks like when it's actually charging. Okay, so how does the power actually end up on the home planet? Now I hope I can find... Oh, here we go. Okay, so the way it ends up on the home planet is through these energy exchanges. So it's part of the transportation. You can see that's what it takes. And what happens is that here I have these accumulators that are being transported around the solar system. And when they arrive here in a moment, you'll see that they go through the accumulator, and this is on charge mode. And whatever excess power you have in your grid, and you can see a huge amount of excess power in this grid, gets used to transform these accumulators into charged accumulators. Okay, so they've just arrived, as you can see, and then what happens is that they get put into these the energy exchange, and then it'll turn on and start charging them, and it'll produce these full accumulators that then go back into the logistics station, and then once there's enough here, then it gets sent off back to the home planet. And then I'll show you what happens on the other end. Once again, passing through the Dyson Sphere, so this will be pretty cool. Look at that. Okay, now I have to find Earth, or not Earth, but the home planet on the other side. So let's see. Oh, here we go. Okay. And I'll keep you along for this ride as well, so you can enjoy the solar sails that are being shot into the Dyson Sphere, which is pretty cool. And you can see in the bottom right there's a accumulator full transport ship that's just arriving to Earth as well. So they get charged pretty quick these days. Oh yeah, sometimes this happens where you actually get bounced off, which is kind of annoying. Now I have to find the planet again. And if you are out of energy, you're out of luck. You're going for a ride, and you're not coming back to the planet. So watch out for that one. Okay, here we go. So I think it's somewhere over here. Ah, yeah, you can see it here. So these energy exchangers are taking the kind of full accumulators and just discharging them into the local power grid. You can see it's kind of unnecessary, the amount that they're discharging, but I don't really care for fiddling around with this anymore, and the system is fast enough for that it can take some waste. So that's how I've set this up. So if you see in here, I think, yeah, there's like 10,000 charged accumulators, so it's very unlikely that it'll ever run out. So yeah, that's the first, I guess, guide that I'll make for the Dyson Sphere program. So you can see, I think this is starting to be built out here, and a few other holes are being patched up. So I think it's a pretty cool game, and it took quite a bit of time to actually scale up all the different production to make this happen. But yeah, it's pretty cool. All right, thanks for watching, and see you next time.